Hello Guyana students, this is your instructor Dan Scollin, and this is the first of several screencasts I will make related to our online courses prior to our trip. And this first one is going to center on human geography of Guyana, but will actually inform the discussion that is under the physical geography course. And of course the two subjects are very closely intertwined, in this week's discussion centered on the question of the relationship between human geography and physical geography, or said another way, the way that physical geography informs human geography is very much going to be informed by this presentation that you will have. So I wanted to start off with some links and references that you will have access to. So I've posted this out under Guyana articles and links. You'll find it under both the courses, and there's a variety of materials that I've been drawing from, and so I wanted to make sure to provide access to you, and you'll actually see specific references to these in the presentation that I will give you in the next few minutes. This is the most basic sort of background information. I recommended this as something that you could look at for your discussion this week, and you can look at things like natural resources. There's information in here related to the way that they use agricultural land and so forth, which obviously has implications between the physical geography and the human, or in this case economic geography. Again, I will speak more to this in the coming minutes. There's a couple of different articles that are rather academic. I provided links to them to you, but I will be drawing some specific quotes that I think are useful and informative from these few articles that I'm showing you on the screen. Another source, and this is something that will be particularly useful for the discussion, in that it addresses the Guyana Shield in particular as a physical feature in the context of economic activity. And so that's a good resource to consult as well. So let's start off with a map of Guyana. Here I'm using the satellite view because it provides some valuable information related to understanding the general physical lay of the land of Guyana, and I will give more detailed discussion of this in the coming weeks. But according to Wikipedia, the country can be divided into 5 natural regions: a narrow and fertile marshy plain along the Atlantic coast, called the Low Coastal Plain, where most of the population lives, indeed 90% of the population. A white sand belt, more inland, hilly sand clay region. This contains most of Guyana's mineral deposits. Again, a good theme to consider in terms of the relationship between the natural physical conditions and the economic or cultural geography. The dense rainforests, forested highland region in the southern parts of the country. The drier savanna regions in the southwest, visible on the imagery here. And the smallest interior lowlands, or interior savanna, consisting mostly of mountains that gradually rise to the Brazilian border. I'm just going to run some slide images that I found on the web by way of providing a backdrop to some of this text that I will be reading to you. This first section is going to derive from an article called Guyanese Strategic Culture. We'll get a definition of that in a moment. I like the opening quote that is in this paper. It reads as follows: "It is not only the case that we must think globally and act locally, that we must do, but we must do more to further the furtherance of global actions. It is in the global sphere that the ultimate destiny of humanity will be acted out. Our part will be a small one, but many small players will shape the nature of the scene." From Sridath Rampal. Guyanese, and I think sets a nice scene for the complex global culture that we live in today and the way smaller countries, smaller players such as Guyana might fit into that. Okay, so strategic culture is the title of this, and it's actually a term I had not previously come across, but I do like the definition. It says the analysis here embraces the definition of strategic culture as the combination of internal and external influences and experiences, geographic, historical, cultural, economic, political, and military, that shape and influence the way a country understands its relationship to the rest of the world. Quoted from Lantis in 2009. This idea of relationship between other places and countries in the world is at the heart of geography. In order to understand the nature of Guyana, it's important to understand the way that European colonial powers influenced and played out in this part of the world. There was a very long indigenous history prior to the arrival of Europeans, which will be the subject of a lecture material that I'll give you next week. But European geopolitical competition in the New World, with victories and defeats, led to a revolving system of territorial ownership. This is quoted from the strategic paper. The Dutch were the first to colonize this area in the 17th century, and their emphasis for export became centered around plantation agriculture, and specifically, as they had in Holland, they developed a very complex and extensive system of canals and seawalls to support what became known as polder agriculture, P-O-L-D-E-R agriculture. More on this later. In 1803, the three Guyanas were ceded to Britain with an agreement, and this was under the Treaty of Paris. Subsequently, slavery was abolished, and this abolition was not accompanied by the closure of sugar and cotton plantations. Hence, cheap labor was still needed. This led to the importing of indentured labor, in particular in East Indians from South Asia, which we'll see are a major part of the Guyanese population today. Portuguese from Madeira, Chinese were imported. So now we start to see the foundation of this very multiracial, multicultural society. The paper goes on to say the combined effects of colonial rule, slavery, indentureship led to the inheritance of a political culture that emphasizes force in governance. Historically influenced factors of race-based values and beliefs that shaped approaches to who gets what, how, and when. Back up for a moment. So for starters, this emphasis, or this idea that the political culture emphasized force in governance. Clearly, if you're running a system of slavery, force is going to be your primary system of governance. Again, we'll hear more about this in a few minutes. And then the second section described the fact that you had race-based values and beliefs begin to shape who gets what, how, and when within the broader culture. And again, something that we'll see addressed in the subsequent papers. The next article that I'm going to draw from is the one titled Cultural Power, Resistance, and Pluralism in Colonial Guyana, 1838 to 1900. And they start off by saying that most Caribbean societies have largely been influenced by the dominance of the plantation system. It is the production regime where sugar plantations, there were other types, but sugar the dominant, both during and after slavery, determined the composition and structure of the societies. already biracial by the end of slavery, 1838 in the British colonies, and subsequently, 1848 in the French West Indies, 1863 in the Dutch West Indies, 1886 in Cuba. That's the sequence of the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean. The societies of the larger, less densely populated territories, such as Guyana, became increasingly multiracial after immigrant workers from India, China, Madeira, and West Africa, among other places, were imported to supplement the local labor force, which had decreased after the emancipation of slaves. Okay, so again, drawing these additional populations in. Many ex-slaves vacated the plantation in search of a more lucrative and self-sufficient way of life, which again created this sort of labor shortage requiring the need for additional people to be brought in. The immigration of new ethnic categories of workers radically altered the composition of these societies. This immigration brought in its wake new social problems, conflicts, and instability associated with the divergent economic, social, and political interests of several economic components. And these were further exacerbated by racial jealousies and animosities among these groups. Okay, so again, an important theme that's going to arise again as we look at sort of the nature of Guyanese society. The dominant white minority in Guyana placed primary emphasis on political control and military coercion to maintain social stability. They go on to say they budgeted between 14 and 25% of its revenue for police and judiciary alone, as opposed to only 7% for education. It was strongly felt that the reality of everyday life in the colony demanded forthright, oftentimes brutal, action for dealing with a mass of barbarous, potentially hostile natives and immigrants. Yet although it was given relatively low priority in the 19th century, the idea of building value consensus was never ignored by the colonial elites, but they clearly were not prepared to rely too heavily on the efficacy in the society open to regular introductions of fresh immigrants. All right, what are they saying? The idea of consensus, right? We like to think our society is based on consensus building for agreement as opposed to brutal force, which in the case of Guyana, certainly in the colonial and slavery era was the mode. And so part of what we see here is a sort of baby steps into sort of the consensus government, but never really being able to get to that point. Cultural consensus was conceived as a long-term goal achievable only after prolonged and sedulous administered process of propaganda, religious proselytization, education, and practical example. Brian Stoddart has espoused the concept of cultural power in a colonial situation. This he defines as the set of ideas, beliefs, rules, conventions concerning social behavior that was carried out throughout the empire by such British servants as administrators, military officers, industrialists, agriculturalists, traders, financiers, settlers, educators, and various kinds of advisors. Again, talking about the system of colonialism. And don't be scared off by the academic language here. Part of the reason I'm reading to the Stew as opposed to assigning it as reading is that this has a fairly strong sort of academic social science bent to it. But I do want to continue on to the next paper, which is Gender, Ethnicity, and Place, Women and Identities in Guyana. And this is a fascinating paper, and they start off by trying to tease out the definitions of ethnicity and race, which I spend some time and attention to in my geography lectures, because they are inherently problematic and difficult concepts, which they nicely address in the following. They start off by saying ethnicity and race perhaps remain two of the most contested terms in social and cultural studies. While a variety of meanings have been attached to them, we define race as constructed out of the separation of human populations by some notion of stock or collective heredity of traits. Okay, so race as being hereditary traits, right? That's what we associate them with. But a key idea here is that it's constructed by humans, largely through some separation of populations. You create this idea of stock or collective heredity. This suggests that race and ethnicity are geographic and historical constructs whose specificity must be named. Okay, specificity and effects must be named, both ethnicity and race. While a variety of meanings have been attached to them, we define race as constructed out of the separation, okay, so we just said that, the separation of human populations by some notion of stock or heredity, while ethnicity as the positing of, here we go, ethnicity, of an origin as a basis for community or collectivity. The basis for community or collectivity, not necessarily heredity, but it can be other things. And that we may use race as a principal boundary marker. It may also be constituted through other parameters such as religion, sexuality, language, and so forth. Okay, so again, a connection between race and ethnicity, but different, right? Because religion, language can define ethnicity. Those are not definitions typically used to associate with race. They go on to say, in this text, we retain ethnicity as a term that recognizes that we all speak from a particular place, out of a particular history, out of a particular experience, a particular culture, without being contained by that position. I like this, of course, because it has a very strong geographic aspect, right? Geography has been called the study of place and space, so that ethnicity comes from speaking from a particular place, a particular history. In this text, they go on to say, we retain ethnicity as a term that recognizes that we all speak from, okay, I have a couple of repeats in my notes here. They go on to say, we reject the notion that ethnicity is natural, immutable, and constructed outside of shifting fields of power. Rather, we understand it to incorporate practices of domination, subordination, inclusion, exclusion, contestation, and negotiation, appropriate in the context of this colonial history. Racialized differences and their purported cultural characteristics are products of the colonial encounter framed by the political and economic needs of the white plantocracy, the planters, and continue to be pervasive in contemporary Guyana. Thus, race serves as the primary ethnic boundary marker between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, the two major groups with which this study is concerned. That is to say, racialized phenotype differences form the basis upon which descriptive and evaluative claims of cultural distinctiveness are made. All right, what does that mean? That means that we have essentially two races, dominant races, the Afro-Guyanese and the Indo-Guyanese. These are also have strong ethnicity ties. For example, you'll see Hinduism among Indo-Guyanese, those that came in from India. Christianity will tend to dominate more in the Afro-Guyanese. So you have ethnicity associations, but are still drawn upon these racial distinctions, right? You can physically see the difference in race between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. Realizing, of course, there's been a lot of mixing of blood through the generations. They go on to talk about gender, and this is an interesting backdrop, and anybody who might be interested in feminist studies, gender studies, would certainly be interested in this article. And they say that boundaries of ethnic groups, although based on a wide variety of criteria, include conforming to cultural practices, central to which are the sexual practices for women. For not only are women biologically responsible for reproducing the group, but they are also charged with the duty of transmitting cultural within the domestic domain and symbolizing group identity and respectability in the wider arena. Okay, so again, interesting, posing the unique cultural and ethnic role that women play within the society, part of what they're addressing within this context. So a lot of interesting things to digest here. I'll just close with a couple of general statements about ethnicity, culture, human geography in Guyana. Guyana has seen a significant emigration of its population, so people leaving Guyana, moving out of the country. There are many that live in the United States and elsewhere, and they in turn will send money back to Guyana in the form of remittances. Those remittances are important to the Guyanese economy and also connect Guyana to the global economy. Guyana continues to have concerns with narcotics, with security, with crime issues. Fortunately, our hosts, Opwal, very carefully constrain our situation and provide a high degree of security. And the political environment continues to have a very strong ethnic, racial basis in the way that political parties play out. So the Indo-Guyanese versus the Afro-Guyanese are going to represent sort of different political parties, if you will. Guyana today has a per capita income of $3,000 a year per person. That's roughly 1/10 of what you would find in the United States. So clearly a country that would consider lower end of the development spectrum, a poorer country, and one that is very much still feeling the effects of this historical process by which the country was formed. Okay, well, that's my introduction to the Guyanese culture. I hope you found this informative, and I look forward to seeing how this plays into our discussion for this week.